Orale, hello there. I'm Robert Martinez, State Historian of New Mexico, and this is New Mexico History in 10 minutes. Post-World War II New Mexico. World War II was the hot war. Now, in the 1950s, would be the Cold War, which would last decades. It's interesting. The United States had joined the forces of Britain, France, Russia to defeat Nazism in Europe. And we were all victorious. It was a joint effort. The United States came in a little later and helped tip the balance and made a major contribution to the Allies' efforts in Europe. Well, the Soviet Union was a major power and threat to Western democracies. So much so that a line was drawn down the center of Berlin in a compromise with the Soviets so that there would be no more hot war, no more fighting between the Soviets and the Western democracies like England, France, and the United States. Everyone was very tired, exhausted, and weary of war. Still, an arms race started to see who would be the more powerful, and it ultimately came down to the Soviet Union, the USSR, and the United States, the USA. Well, the United States needed scientists, needed brilliant minds, and ultimately, in a twist of fate, had to compromise. President Truman did not want any scientists coming to our country to work on weapons who had a Nazi past. But that was going to be a difficult order to fill because a lot of the scientists in Germany had been members of the Nazi Party. So Operation Paperclip was when military leaders would present President Truman with these scientists' biographies and resumes, but they would put a fake bio on top with a paperclip to show that they were not affiliated with the Nazis. So in a bizarre twist of fate, by the late 1940s and early 50s, there were Nazi scientists operating in places like Texas and New Mexico and other weapons labs. Well, this was into the 1950s, this fear of the Soviets, fear of nuclear war. Again, you see this in the movies of the times. The movie Them, an atomic blast causes ants to become giant in the deserts of New Mexico and Nevada. And this fear of communist takeover. Well, that's the international scene. In New Mexico, there are certain movements that are going to explode in the 1960s. And you could say they're embodied in the person of Reyes Lopez Tijerina. He was a Tejano of Mexican background, a minister, a fiery speaker, charismatic, able to lead people to do things like any great leader or not so great leader, but he had actually started a movement kind of before the hippies started theirs, or even the beatniks. His movement went to Texas. He got into a little bit of trouble, so he was kind of like a folk hero or a folk villain. But by the early 60s, by about 1963, he establishes the Alianza Federal de Mercedes in New Mexico. This is a federal alliance of land grants. He awakens a sleeping giant in New Mexico. The idea that there were Nuevo Mexicanos in New Mexico who had lost lands in the 1800s and into the 1900s because of shrewd or even criminal lawyers and businessmen who made up the Santa Fe Ring and then were countered by the Gorras Blancas, and resulted in a lot of poverty, a loss of culture, a loss of identity. And the people of New Mexico were aware of this, But Tijerina was able to muster in them the energy and the fire to really fight back against the federal government and the state government. He was quite shrewd. He was able to utilize legal concepts. He studied the laws of the Indies, and he was able to, or at least attempted to square the towns of northern New Mexico and the land grants that had belonged to the people of northern New Mexico as sovereign communities, much like the pueblos were considered since the colonial times under Spain, then colonial times under Mexico, then colonial times under the United States. So he also he brings this term Indo-Hispano to the New Mexicans. I was always intrigued by the term Indo-Hispano. It has a dual meaning. On the one hand, it means indigenous, Native American, and Hispano, meaning mestizo, mixed background. And that's true. We are of Spanish background, but also Mexican Indian, Puebloan Indian, and Genízaro Indian. So that's one way to look at Indo-Hispano. But the other way to look at it, which is also very true, is that the Hispano people of New Mexico have been here so long that we're also Indo, we're also indigenous. Not indigenous like the Native Americans, let me be very clear about that. Nonetheless, we've been here for 10 generations, 12 generations. There is no Mexico or Spain for the New Mexicans to go back to. It's been too long, and we've been here for a very long time. So he also introduces this term, and ultimately, there are certain acts of resistance and rebellion. One is when his wife burns a sign in one of the national forests to show that that land, much of the federal land, used to be communal land grants that were granted under both Spanish rule and Mexican rule. But the act that really grabs the attention of the federal government, the national media, and even the world was on the 5th of June, 1967. Año de 67, 5 de junio fue el día, hubo una revolución allá por Tierra María. This is the opening verse of my late father Roberto Martinez's corrido, or Mexican ballad, about those events, the Corrido de Rio Arriba. It just says that in the year of 1967, on the 5th of June, there was a revolution in Tierra Maria, county of Rio Arriba, New Mexico. Well, members of the Alianza had gone to the courthouse at Tierra Maria to liberate or to set free some members of their movement who had been arrested. It's a fascinating historical event because it involves Hispanics on both sides. It involves military people. It involves law enforcement. Ultimately, the National Guard are called in by Governor David Cargo, who orders them to come in. It's a little bit cloudy. He claims his lieutenant governor did it. Some documents show that he did it. Nonetheless, the National Guard come in and they round up men, women, and children who are part of the Alianza movement, and they're kept in animal corrals in the small towns around Tierra Maria. The national news comes in. I think there was even a featured spot on 60 Minutes that showed my dad's group playing the corrido. But I've seen news stories from the time, and it's fascinating and even shocking and disturbing what they say. One news story said, Northern New Mexico and Northern New Mexicans, Americans in name only, with heritage and bloodlines of violence, with bloody penitentes and violent Native Americans in their history. And it just goes on to really put the people of northern New Mexico in a very, very bad light, and specifically Reyes Lopez Tijerina. He would be vilified by certain extremist groups on the right as being a communist, a puppet of Castro in Cuba, and a revolutionary attempting to overthrow the state government of New Mexico and even the federal government of the United States. Tijerina becomes both hero and villain. He polarizes New Mexicans. There's New Mexicans who disown him and many who embrace him as a hero. He was a friend of my dad's. I met Reyes Lopez Tijerina many times in my lifetime. The last time I went to my mom and dad's house a couple years before he passed away just to have some lunch, I dropped in and there he was sitting at the kitchen table. So it was always an amazing experience to talk with Reyes Lopez Tijerina. He could talk about history and also could shock you and make you think and make you question things, but he was never boring and is definitely a major person in New Mexico's history, a history, if you've been watching this series, that has both amazing bravery, but violence and very sad, sad events. There's been revolutions, revolts, resistance movements throughout the centuries. And I think when we look at the events at Tierra Maria in 1967, we can say that that is definitely up there with other major historical events that of similar magnitude, like the Pueblo Revolt or the Battle at Acoma, the Chimayo Revolt of 1837, or the Battle at Taos in 1847. So these are the events that have shaped New Mexico history throughout the centuries. I'm Robert Martinez. Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias. Hasta pronto.